We're going to get started, and I want to say, one, thank you all for coming for today's panel. So starting off with introductions, we have Jane Prince, who is a city council member for St. Paul, the 7th Ward. We have Traherne, Pollard, founder and CEO of We Push for Peace. We also have Deepinder Mayal, the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Minnesota. And we had a few changes up in the last minute, but this is still going to be a very exciting panel, so I thank you all. And I will turn it to each of our panelists just to give a brief introduction for themselves. So if Jane, you would like to start off, then you.
Ladies first.
Well, it's really an honor to be here. As a St. Paul City Council person, this is truly something that's very important to me, although I didn't come prepared today with comments, so I'm going to fill in as best I can. I've been on the St. Paul City Council for 8 years. I'm not seeking a third term, so I'll be through at the end of this year. It has been a huge honor and thrill to be representing my neighbors and the people of St. Paul, and particularly at such a tumultuous time with COVID, with George Floyd, and all the ways in which our governmental units are figuring out we've got to do things differently, and we've got to do things better, and we need to listen to people. So in any event, thank you for having me.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Joe. I really appreciate this opportunity. I went to Georgetown University of Law a little while ago, and I was part of a training out there, and prompted me being contacted here. So my name is Traherne Pollard. Trey. It's easier. I'm the founder and CEO of We Push for Peace. And our objective is to make a difference in the lives of our youth as well as our community. We have a resource center that's in North Minneapolis, right on Broadway and Lindale, where that corner used to be one of the most tumultuous corners in the Twin Cities area. I took over the day-to-day operations last September, so marks 1 year. And since we've been there, there has not been one shooting, one death, nothing. And so we're that organization if you're from Minnesota. And so what I wound up doing was, you hear people say that you need to meet people where they are. So what I said was, okay, I opened a resource center right there where they are. And we provide housing, we provide mental health instabilities, we provide employment as well. But I've had the pleasure of also expanding my organization, so I now employ ex-felons across 13 states, and we have over 400 plus men and women that work for the organization. So it is a pleasure to be here, and I am looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Deepinder Mayal. I'm the executive director of the ACLU of Minnesota. I have been in that role for about 1.5 years now. And the ACLU has been on the forefront of some of the most significant civil liberties and civil rights fights in the country over the last 100 years. And free speech is certainly central to our work and our mission nationally and here in the state. So I just really appreciate being invited and being on this panel with everyone. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your introductions, and so we're going to get into it. And so the panel today is protecting the right to protest. And so I thought, we would ground it first in, the First Amendment particularly shapes our right to protest in the United States. And so from a legal perspective, Deepinder, I would be interested in hearing a little bit more on what is the historical significance of the First Amendment and why is that so important?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, right? So, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the right to protest here in Minnesota, particularly post George Floyd, and the protest movements that we saw after George Floyd, and the treatment of those protests, and recognizing that that was a movement for racial justice. And when there is protest movements for racial justice in America, there is a very significant and clear history. And there is no speech that is more politically controversial than when people ask for racial justice. No speech has met more, and when I say that I mean has met more violence directed by the state than the movement for racial justice in America. I know there's a lot of comments made about how sometimes the First Amendment might be at odds with the movement for racial justice. And the reality is, in this country and through the history, and if you look at the civil rights movement, the First Amendment rights to protest is the right that gave space for the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement is the movement that gave the ability for us to define the First Amendment in a way that protects free speech. And it is really important to note that, because when we think about these movements, the Black Lives Matter movement and the movements that have come up since the death of George Floyd, it is really important to recognize the violence and the narratives that surround it. And I'll give you a statistic, and that's looking at the civil rights movement for a little bit of context here. After the Birmingham marches, right? These were the marches in 1963 that saw 2,000 children put into prisons in Alabama intentionally in acts of civil disobedience. In the 10 weeks that followed, there were 758 demonstrations in America. There were over 14,000 arrests in 186 municipalities. The level of violence that was inflicted during the civil rights movement by government officials was extreme. And again, it's putting this whole thing into context, because when a marginalized people who do not have political rights or economic rights or social rights, when those rights are stripped from them, the only thing left that they have, if you really think about it, is their voice. It is the only thing that is left if you have been attacked and targeted by the government. So that voice is central to our rights, and this is going to your question. And when it comes to your right to speak and your political speech, the government has zero role in controlling your political speech, period. Absolutely zero role. And that is a very important premise to understand about the First Amendment and your right to protest. Now, that's not always been the case, and we'll talk, I think, a little bit more about it and how it plays out in protests. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
And so you talked a little bit about how the civil rights kind of played a catalyst as for us defining what does it mean when we talk about free speech. And so similarly, when we talk about the resurgence of Black Lives Matter as a result of the murder of George Floyd in 2020, I'm curious to know from a community perspective, particularly Trey, doing work in community, and then your role as a city council member, how that showed up in community, particularly residents protesting, and what that looked like, or the guidance or engagement you were able to have with those individuals.
I'm glad you pointed that out, because myself and my organization was on the ground from day one. It goes a little bit deeper than that for me, because I called him Big G. I knew George personally, and we provided numerous services for George himself. It was very trying. It was very frustrating. I was very angry. And so from a community standpoint, what we were trying to do, because in most cases they were trying to silence their voices. And so what we were trying to do was create a platform so that their voices can be heard. The problem with that was it was the individuals that was around them which is why they were pointing the finger at Black Lives Matter, right? And so what we were trying to do was we were trying to deal with those individuals that was around them to cause chaos and confusion, so that their message couldn't be slurred or they couldn't muddy their waters. Let's be clear, we've been fighting for this for quite some time. I think what had happened was we had the opportunity, the world had an opportunity to see with their own two eyes what we had been talking about for almost 400 years. That's why it became so much more impactful. So from a community standpoint, it was nothing going to stand in their way of that, of their voices being heard.
And then from a local city government perspective, what role do you think, if any, you have as a council member, particularly making sure that residents are able to, express themselves freely, but also do it in a way that is able to make sure that it doesn't intensify the current situation that's at place?
I'm going to back us up to the murder of Philando Castile a few years earlier, because that happened outside of St. Paul. The officer was a Falcon Heights police officer, but the protest happened at the governor's mansion and at the Capitol, because we're the capital, we're the state capital, and there were, and those were both really good focal points for the whole metro community to come together. We learned a lot through that. I think a couple things. St. Paul is fortunate to have a pretty good police department. We're not perfect by any means, but we had a history of, since the early 90s, of innovation and reform in our department, a series of African American chiefs who made a big impact on how our police operate. But we made a bunch of mistakes with Philando Castile. Summit Avenue had to be closed. That was something that nobody wanted to do. It was affecting neighbors around the governor's mansion. And the police figured out, we've got to accommodate the protesters. We've got to figure out how to turn down the volume on the cries that we weren't allowing them their right to protest. Additionally, obviously, there were elected officials involved in the protests as well. The closing of I-94 by protesters and the use of rubber bullets was a real low point in the Philando Castile protests. So when we're faced with civil unrest again in 2020, after the terrible murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, we knew that we could expect the protests to move to St. Paul. And the police were as prepared as they could be. We had problems in the Midway. I believe there may have been rubber bullets used in the Midway. I think, to Trey's point, we had some of the infiltration of people, but we definitely were working closely, and the police were trying hard to stay in touch with Black Lives Matter and so forth. I think the other thing that really made a huge difference over here was Melvin Carter as our mayor. We have an African American mayor who has grew up in the Rondo neighborhood, and so was able to communicate, I think, probably better than the rest of us city council members, on how we needed to handle this, how we needed to look at this, and how we needed to support free speech. Again, I know it wasn't perfect. The other thing I'll mention is, much to my surprise, it wasn't surprising that there was protest about George Floyd in the Midway, because that's a large concentration of our African American community. And it's easier to get to from St. Paul. But I represent the east side, southeast side of St. Paul, and there was an enormous fallout at Sunray Shopping Center. Particularly, a couple of fires were started. There was a fair amount of looting. And so the fact that it extended over to the east side was something that made a huge impact on all of us. But again, I think that we had learned from the earlier experience with needing to accommodate and support free speech was a really important part of how we were able to react with George Floyd.
And so I feel like a theme that I hear coming out of it is strong leadership, whether it's a local community organization, whether it's elected officials, or whether it's an organization like the LCLU. And so in that particularly, how has this contributed to the public discourse in Minnesota, and more particularly, has it, created an opportunity for policy changes? Are there policy changes that you have seen, come about since you've been in city council as a result of, particularly George Floyd? And then you all with organizations, are there policy changes that you're pushing for that are relevant to this conversation?
I will say that our police have asked us, they'd like to see greater clarity in our ordinances around what you can and can't bring to a protest. Obviously, when people come to protest, they bring whatever they're going to bring. It's, you think about rakes and shovels and so forth. And what we had seen, what we had witnessed in the insurrection activities in DC was that people came to the protest with, rake handles and axe handles and things that would not be weapons unless you wanted to use them as such. So the police had suggested an ordinance that said you can't bring, these kinds of household items to a protest if you're planning to weaponize them. And that went nowhere. The community, we went out to have public meetings about it. We wanted to get feedback from people, and it was simply a non-starter. So that's something that is kind of in the background. Another ordinance we were looking at is providing greater clarity. Free speech protests are always allowed whether you have a permit or not. But there was effort to make our permit language a little bit more accessible and to work with community to figure out how can we work together on accommodating your desire to turn out and protest. Again, that ordinance went nowhere. It's like, do not talk to us about permits. Do not talk to us about figuring out how many people we're going to have there and being able to predict to the city that there won't be hundreds more people that turn out. So again, these ordinance ideas came forward from my perspective with the best of intentions, but we appropriately listened to the people that felt they would be most affected by them, and we did not move forward.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to some of this. I think that when it comes to policy changes, there's two issues here, right? One is that there is a protest movement, right? And we're talking about what happens during the protest. But this protest movement was directed at behavior by the law enforcement, by police. And that's the same entity that's policing the protest, right? It is a very unique situation. Well, it's actually not that unique. It's actually has been time, for a very long time, police brutality has been a focus of these movements. So when it comes to policy changes when it comes to the protesting, the specific protesting, there have been some changes. And part of that is due to a lawsuit that we brought. Nikema Armstrong was actually lead plaintiff in our lawsuit. But during one of those protests, there was significant violence perpetrated by the Minneapolis Police Department and others indiscriminately. Use of tear gas, use of chemical irritants, use of extreme physical violence. Again, indiscriminately, targeting protesters, targeting journalists. And this required a lawsuit. And yes, there was folks that were saying we can make these changes without the lawsuit. But it's the lawsuit and the settlement that gives you the ability to enforce that moving forward. So one of the changes is that police cannot now use tear gas without getting an approval from above. And we believe that that's what happened at recently with another killing, where police had to get an okay from above to use tear gas, and they didn't get the okay, and tear gas wasn't used. So you have this environment where you need to have police on policies that keep them from escalating and continue to de-escalate. Another part of the settlement that we won was that, and this should seem obvious, is that police cannot use tear gas, chemical irritants, or attack peaceful protesters, period. And that makes sense, right? A police officer operating on a protest line is no different than a police officer operating on a sidewalk when you walk by them. They do not have the right to harm you unless there is probable cause for suspicion of a crime. They can't stop you unless they have that. And they can't use force, and particularly can't use indiscriminate excessive force if they don't have reason to use that force. So it's this idea that once you enter this protest environment, that police can put on this militarized front and not behave within the confines of the Constitution. That is a complete misnomer. And that goes against your First Amendment rights to protest.
So one of the things I think you alluded to is in June of 2023, the U.S. Department of Justice found that the Minneapolis Police Department discriminated against Black and Native American people in its enforcement activities, including the use of force following stops, and violated the rights of people engaged in protected speech. And so starting back with you, Deepinder, one of the things I think we benefit from us being in the room and being able to have these conversations and be well informed. But the reality is many of the individuals in the community don't benefit from this opportunity or exposure. And so how do your organizations ensure or work with community around community engagement so that they know what their rights are when they're being violated, and they also know how to follow up from that, whether it's filing a report with the right organizations, et cetera?
I think it's important to note that there's still a lot of gray areas, even as it pertains to policies and the way that they are written anyway, right? Law enforcement has the ability to say that I felt. That's it. I felt. So it's still a lot of confusion that surrounds the way the policies that are being wrote, right? So alluding to what we were just talking about, we have a lot of informational sessions because misinformed information by misinformed people causes chaos and confusion. So what we try to do is we try to have informational sessions for young men and women that's in our community so that they can be educated as it pertains to things to this magnitude. And that's very important because oftentimes in our community, our young folks is only using their phones for Facebook and Twitter. Right, so we try to bring awareness to things that they need to be informed about, especially as it pertains to the law. What I will allude to is this. While we were out there, I was in contact with Governor Walsh on a day-to-day basis, and we were sharing information. And at the end of the day, what we were trying to do is keep our community safe, right? And so when they started talking about the council in Minneapolis, I know every last one of them, and I know them personally. as it pertains to policies that they wanted to really work on, the first thing they did was they came to the community. That's another part of the problem. We making policies and procedures without going to the community that's being affected by these policies and procedures that they're putting in place. And so the council came to the community repeatedly, and then they wrote their policies and procedures to present to the mayor after they met with the community, right? And that's an important piece. That's a very, very important piece. And then the last thing is this, right, that we've been stressing and talking about for quite some time, the accountability when an officer does do something that's to this magnitude, right? If you hold society members accountable for everything that we do, then it should be no different from anybody else. And the problem is they don't do that as often as they should, which is why the behavior consists and it continues, right? Our organization have a great relationship with both Minneapolis, St. Paul, etc., because you can't reimagine or rebuild communities if they're not involved, right? You have to be willing to do that. We have taken that step to show that we are actually able and willing to do that. So during the unrest, did it prompt a lot of changes? Well, the changes that it prompted, those changes should have happened a long time ago anyway, right? So to no surprise of us, I mean, I'm glad that it did. We put pen to the paper, right? But here it is, we advocating for something that should have already happened. So no, that don't put a smile on my face, right? What will put a smile on my face is when we have accountability. That's a whole nother conversation, right? Because we still know that we have these types of behaviors in our community, but again, when those behaviors is going unchecked, then it's going to continue to happen.
Couldn't agree more about the concept of accountability. I can tell you at the ACLU, we believe in an integrated advocacy approach. So, we have lawsuits and we have a legal team, but we also have a policy team and folks lobbying and essentially full-time lobbyists. We also have a community education and advocacy component. So we have organizers on staff too. Because it takes kind of all of it together working to push these changes. We had the lawsuit for the treatment of protesters. We had a lawsuit for the treatment of journalists. We have a pending lawsuit now for for homeless encampment sweeps and the violation of rights during those sweeps. We have another lawsuit for the treatment of disciplinary records by the city of Minneapolis. Policing disciplinary records, that goes to the heart of accountability. So those are just one tool in the toolbox that we are trying to push to make this social change, which is a longer road, right? And there's a lot of other issues. The disparities are deeper than just the policing system. But like I said, what makes this one of the most significant and potent movements in the civil rights movement is that it's targeting the policing system. And we have that visual proof, body cam after body cam of showing what is happening and what has been happening. And it is created a different environment.
And so we think about local government, particularly what steps do you think local government can take to balance, obviously public safety, but also the right to protest or the freedom of expression of community members?
We were able to connect with some of the individuals that were leading a lot of these protests. And they would actually reach out to me and say, well, we plan to be here. Can you guys come? Because they then knew from previous protests that they were having people that were intertwining with them that was causing chaos and confusion. So they would actually call me and say, hey, Trey, we'll be over on blah, blah, blah. Can you guys come over to just make sure that our protests can be peaceful? And that's exactly what we would do, right? That's exactly what we would do. Because, again, we knew that they were doing exactly what their right is. And then we also knew that it was individuals that was causing chaos and confusion and was intertwining with them, and they were getting blamed for everything. You know, so that's what, you know, toward the ending portion of the George Floyd area. Then you obviously went directly into, say, Dante Wright, right? So the same individuals that was organizing with George Floyd then started organizing with Dante Wright. And I'm a resident of Brooklyn Center, so I cared about my little city, so I was there every day. But them giving us that information allowed us to be out there to assist and making sure that their voices could be heard, and the ones that, you know, called themselves being destructive and causing chaos and confusion and throwing bricks and all that type of stuff was not even a part of the BLM movement. And we was dealing with them accordingly.
And as an elected official, how do you balance that, you know, delicate balance between, you know, protecting or public safety rather, and then also empowering community to still, you know, participate in free expression?
Sure. I think one point I probably haven't made strongly enough is that St. Paul has a really good police department with a really good history of trying to be better, to learn from previous mistakes. A series of chiefs from, as I said, from the early 90s with Bill Finney through John Harrington and Tom Smith and then Todd Axtell, of really continuous reform and continuous efforts to diversify the department. When Chief Axtell was sworn in 2016, diversifying the department was one of his top 3 goals, along with trying to being much more intentional about community engagement. He created a community engagement unit, and also to try to get guns off the street, which has probably been the toughest nut to crack. But I think, to your point, Trey, our police department, I think from the early 90s, were under a consent decree brought by the lawsuit brought by the NAACP, and the relationships between our African American community organizations, whether it's Black Lives Matter, you know, to the left, and the NAACP to the more traditional. The police have strong relationships within the community. So I think, you know, my ability to talk about how often they meet with each other, what the communications setup is when we're preparing for civil unrest or we're responding to civil unrest, is something I can't speak directly to. But as I said, from what we learned with Philando Castile's, the protests around Philando's death, to what we brought forward in our work, the police brought forward with their response to George Floyd, was something that was an evolving understanding of how we need to work with community. There was something else I was going to mention, but I'll bring it up in a minute. The council, you know, our council obviously feels very strongly about this, and is very supportive of asking the hard questions of our police. We have formed, under the mayor's leadership, an Office of Neighborhood Safety with a variety of alternative responses to situations. So, as in every other city, the response to unrest, protest in our community is an evolving thing. And you know, I'd love to take any questions on it if there are some specific ones.
And so one of the things I think was really unique, particularly with George Floyd, is this increasing, you know, use of technology and social media. And so particularly, how do you all think about organizations and individuals, particularly around them protesting, and encouraging them to participate, but also being mindful of, the implications of like recording police and how that shows up. And so I guess my question is, how do you all think about the role of social media and technology, particularly in the communities that you work, and empowering them to protest?
I often encourage young men and women, or for anybody for that magnitude, is to not be afraid to share how you feel. If that's a choice of theirs, then and they believe in that, then that's something that they should do. I oftentimes, ironic enough, feel as though social media is also a root cause to a lot of things that happen in the different communities as well, because I deal with this on a day-to-day basis, right? You'll hear community members say, well, it's getting cold outside, so the crime will slow down. Unfortunately, that's very untrue. That's when the crime ramps up. For those of you that don't know, I'm going to share it with you right quick. Individuals start what we call beefing, beefing on social media. So when it gets a little warmer and they can actually come outside, then they carry out what they were talking about all winter long on social media. When I see you, so it actually ramps up in the wintertime. So I think that social media hurts our young men and women to some magnitude on social media. And then the depiction of what's going on, I think that media themselves, they report on what they want to report on. They report on what they want society to see, right? They're not going to talk about an organization that's in the community on a day-to-day basis and the lives that we impacted. They actually don't even care to have a story about it, right? A 16-year-old young man that just comes home from being incarcerated, that was in foster care his whole life, then get his GED, then get his commercial driver's license, is now a business owner at 19 years old with 4 trucks. They're not going to talk about that, right? So the media can play a bigger role. It can be more positive versus all the negativity that you see. So I think that it kind of goes both ways. As it pertains to protesting and protecting yourself, yes, it can help you. But as it pertains to the day-to-day and the realities of these communities in which we work in, it actually hurts you.
And do you all think that the media coverage influenced the local city government's response to the protest of George Floyd?
100%. 100%. But I'll let you.
Well, I can talk about media in general. I've got a lot of comments about media and the way that this is depicted. And when I think about media, I sometimes would like to think about it historically, right? So if you look at the way mainstream media news coverage covered the civil rights movement, and what you saw in depictions even on film and on TV, there was this kind of sympathetic tone that was being communicated during that era. I don't know what the chicken or the egg is, but you also have during that time the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, right? This mirror of policy that is also being mirrored in the way media is depicting something. Fast forward to the 90s and to the mid-90s specifically, and you see a completely different depiction in mainstream media. You see violence. You see the terms like super predator. You see the idea of wilding, and this notion, and then you see it in culture too. You see movies about violence, gang culture. You see violence in music, and it all reinforces itself. And what do you get in the 90s? You get some of the most draconian criminal laws coming out of the federal government. You get 3 strikes laws passing all through the states. You get mass incarceration going up. You get immigration reform, which starts the modern detention system as we know it. And then you move forward. And so the media is a really important role here, because the next media moment is 2001, right? Is September 11th, right? And you have nationalism, patriotism, Islamophobia, and you have all these other layers get pushed on top of it. So when you look at this moment of Floyd's murder, and you look at the way it's depicted, it's a really important question to ask. What does it look like? What has the media focused on? What has the media focused on during protests? What have they shown? Are they showing rioting, or are they showing the peaceful protesters? And that narrative, like I said, I don't know what comes first, chicken or egg here, but it's a good indicator to what policies are going to start coming out, and what you're going to see in laws, and what you're going to see that comes afterwards. I mean, we saw proposals at the state legislature that would have created significant criminal ramifications for blocking a highway, blocking an airport, getting involved with pipeline protests, right? So where does this go, right? Where do these acts go? And there was even one proposal that said you couldn't get student loans if you were involved with some of these protests, right? So, and this is, it may seem like it's not targeted at speech, but again, remember, we're talking about a movement for racial justice, which is, like I said before, the most controversial of speeches.
And so when you share that in all that context, what challenges and/or opportunities do you think lie ahead, and what is the future of protecting the right to protest in the United States look like?
Well, so again, integrated advocacy approach. In some ways, the movements of the 60s and 70s, whether it was the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement, have created this moment for theoretically apex political speech, right? In a way that's even more so than other countries in the world, right? Particularly around, say, hate speech, and the way hate speech is regulated in the United States versus in another country. So in some ways, some of that work has already been done, right? We have apex political speech protection. And the job of us now is to protect that and to keep it where it is and to keep it flowing and to watch as it encroaches, not just on the protest field, right? But in the classroom, like we were talking about before, right? In all of these other spaces, because it's starting to encroach in ways which is pushing back on that concept of apex political speech, of the ability to have the government have no role, again, in your political voice, because they should not have any role in what your political voice is and controlling what your political voice is.
And to layer that even further, when we think about technology and surveillance, obviously it's raising concerns about privacy during protest. And so what advances, or rather, with advances in surveillance technology having the potential to infringe on protesters' rights, is that a concern that you think of? Is that a conversation you all are having, at the city council level? Is that a conversation you're having within your organizations?
I'm not ready. I've got to think this through a little more.
Like I stated before, I think that, at one point, some of the facilitators that was protesting, we sat down before they actually did it. And so the organizer was like, I want you guys to be protected at all time. I don't want you guys to be hurt, blah, blah, blah. So they came up with this concept of putting their phones on their chest and had a recording as they was out there protesting. So again, you have a lot of great individuals that's out there just that simply is fighting for the rights that they truthfully shouldn't even have to be fighting for, right? That's the moral of the story, right? We're fighting for something that we shouldn't even have to be fighting for. But in the process of that, they're being very educated and knowing that, some things can go left, some things can go left pretty quickly. And the way you protect yourself is they actually hired videographers, and they was with their videos on, just again to divert some of the actions that was going on around them, and if they were approached by law enforcement, they recording that as well. So it definitely will help somebody think twice about doing something foolish foolishness. So I think that's a win-win personally, and that's one that we've always conveyed to individuals that we were working with.
And the inverse of that question, do you all think that it poses potentially in the future a threat for citizens to feel that their rights are being infringed upon using surveillance technology and things of that nature?
Sure, I can talk to that. So yeah, I mean, first off, you do not have the movements that you have without the technology advancements that we have. The cameras, the body cams, the cell phones, it has, and the ability to use social media to get word out, to organize, to cut around mainstream narratives. It is part and parcel of the place we are right now in this movement, is because of the power of that media. That said, there's a lot of growing up for our rights to do to catch up to these technologies. And particularly with some of these surveillance technologies. I can tell you, we just filed a lawsuit against the city of Bloomington for use of facial recognition software, right? So this was facial recognition software that was used that identified somebody, our client, who was picked up, and the actual suspect in this crime, if you had done just a little bit of basic police work, just a little bit of basic police work, you would recognize that this person's a different height. They've got a different, they don't have tattoos. This person was at work. You could check a time card. There's all these different things that would have resulted in this person not being arrested and charged and convicted of this crime. And having to go through the process of having the conviction overturned, and now we are suing the city of Bloomington for those violations because of relying on this technology and skipping over the fundamental constitutional rights of having basic probable cause before you arrest somebody.
Thinking in terms of surveillance, there have been two issues that have come up in my time on the council. The first one was the change to body-worn cameras for the police. And Rich Neumeister is here from Minkoji. Oh, you're not with Minkoji. Oh, sorry, but a First Amendment guy who was part of that debate and conversation. And over a period of time, as the city studied that, and our current chief, Axe Henry, led the effort to do the research and come up with the policies for St. Paul. This is something that, obviously over time we're constantly evaluating, and I think, and I'd be curious if it's your experience, Trey, but I feel like both for our law enforcement people and the people they confront, body-worn cameras have been a positive way of ensuring that we have good information. So that was one. The jury is probably still out, but on balance, I would say from my perspective that it seems to have been well received by citizens and the police alike. More recently, we went through review of a police policy. They did not need to get council approval for using drones in St. Paul. And so we had a number of presentations. They went out to the community. To your point, Trey, they built the policy from going out to the community and having lots of meetings about it and considering all of that input so that it was something that didn't become a controversy when they adopted it. It remains to be seen if it's something that's going to have to be amended or changed, but it is a surveillance system, and it's something that the city felt it needed to have its own. For the opportunities that it had in the past to need a drone would use the sheriff's department. And for any of you from St. Paul, you probably know that the Sheriff's Department and the St. Paul Police have different ways of dealing with law enforcement and the public. So having our police have the drones and controlling the drones was the preferred way to go.
And so I do want to leave a few minutes for questions from the audience. So my last question for the panelists will be, looking towards the future, what best practices would you share with the audience, particularly to empower us when we think about protesting?
Well, certainly what Trey has said, it's that we need to keep communication really, we need to do our absolute best to keep open and trustworthy communication with our various organizations and in our communities, so that there is some level of trust that we're starting with. It was something that Chief Axtell used to talk a lot about, and he picked it up from Chief Finney, which was you want to constantly be working on building a bank of trust with your community, because when something goes wrong, you're going to have to draw on it. And what that led to were things, and I think we're seeing this maybe more nationally, is that when bad things happen in our community, before the city attorney is advising the chief on how to respond, he's standing up and apologizing. So we've definitely changed the way we don't hunker down anymore and try to protect information. And I believe we're not perfect, as Rich frequently reminds me, but that is the goal. So good communication with the community, and obviously respect for people's need to be able to speak out when they're, as I think it was you, Depinder, who said, when you've lost everything, what you have left is your voice. And what you also have left is the anger to be motivated to be violent. And we understand that is a natural reaction to the terrible things that happen in communities. So anyway, building trust, building greater understanding, and keeping communication very open between all of us.
Like I said, it's kind of like two issues we're talking to here, right? There's a racial justice movement for accountability and against policing and other issues, and then there's like what happens at protests, right? And then when that police force shows up at that protest, all I would say is that this should not chill speech. The actions of the police that show up in their in whatever they show up in with their body armor and their tanks, you're not supposed to be chilling speech. The speech is vital. It is important, and you have a right to make it heard and continue to make it heard. And we'll do whatever we can at the ACLU to stand up for those rights and that core principle of that right to protest for these issues. So.
The advice that I would give anyone is, one, make sure that you have all the correct information. Two, make sure you ask questions. And three, if you're planning on being a part of a protest because that's exactly how you feel, make sure that you're with someone, and so that you won't be out there by yourself. And just make sure that you look out for each other. And when you see things that's happening inappropriately, then disengage yourself from that situation, because it's only going to progressively get worse, right? So I always encourage people to stand up for what you believe in, whether that's protesting or whether that's you volunteering with a local organization, whatever that may look like for you. I encourage you to do that, right? Again, if you're planning on being a part of a protest to any magnitude, ask questions. You know, often what we were saying was just people that were just mad and angry. They just wanted to feel like they was a part of something, and then you look up and they getting shot with tear gas and they getting tumbled over, and they, you know what I mean? So that experience turned out to be extremely horrible for them. You can prevent that from happening just by asking questions before you decide to go, and make sure you go with someone. So that's my encouragement to people that wants to be a part of a protest or anything to that magnitude.
And I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience, if there are any. Going once.
Don't be shy. Don't be shy.
My name's Arthur. This question is mostly for the ACLU for the most part, but a lot of times when we see the actions out that are being recorded by the police or by citizens, even by police body cameras, we see actions that we don't expect. I mean, we also expect that whoever commits crimes or what we view as crimes, that they'd be held accountable. So my question is, as Derek or whatever his name was held accountable for his actions, what else can we do to help individual police officers be held accountable when they very rarely are?
Thanks for the question. I mean, there's a lot of reforms that are being proposed. The Department of Justice has a they're working on a consent decree with the city of Minneapolis that addresses a lot of these issues, right? The question of accountability and what happens through the disciplinary process for a police officer when they have infractions. So, I mean, what we can do as individuals is, educate yourself about those groups and those movements that are pushing for this, that have been pushing for police reform. I would say here for, decades, but again, pulling back to the history of this, we're talking about 50 years of movements for the end of police brutality. I mean, the American Indian movement, which was founded here in Minneapolis, one of their core reasons for starting was police brutality by the city of Minneapolis, right? So figure out and understand from the community and these organizations what reforms they've identified, whether it's no-knock warrants, whether it's some of these very specific policy changes and accountability changes, and then continue to push, lobby, push your legislatures, and get active, right? I don't think that it's a mystery, is what I'm saying. It's political will, and it's pressure, and it's movement building, and it's the things that have resulted in this success, time and time again. So I hope that answers your question.
I'll see if there's any last questions out there. All right, if not, please join me in thanking our panelists for participating in the discussion today.